So now that you've gone through the basics, we've got our transparency, color, gradient, swatches, pathfinder, and layers. These are kind of our 6 most useful palettes that we're pretty much going to have open all the time. Just because of the way they sort of work together, the way you kind of want to lay them out in your workspace. Probably, it's customizable, but there's just a basic thing about what you can do is you can grab the tab and you can connect or dock your tabs underneath each other. It's not super, it's a little different. Like if I grab this and hover next, it's going to put it in the same tab set. But if I wait until I see that little blue hover there, that's going to snap it down underneath so that these are kind of move like more like a group. So I personally like to snap my transparency, gradient, and color like this, and then have my swatches separate over here so I can drag my swatches in and out. Because you're generally using these 4 palettes for color work. There's one more that we're going to go through, but we're not there yet. It's a little bit more advanced. This is the basics of it, though. Our layers, if we're moving stuff and adjusting things around in layers, that's kind of a different sort of task. We're generally not coloring things in and filling colors and stuff. We're sort of adjusting, managing our shape. So that's that. And Pathfinder's its own thing too. So that's shape building and shape management. But swatches, transparency, gradient, and color, those all really go kind of together. So you want to probably dock these 3 palettes together so you can just kind of adjust them. You can also kind of minimize them like this by clicking this little arrow. You don't want to close them by clicking this X because then you got to rebuild them again. You can also save your workspaces. It's under Window, Workspace, New Workspace, Manage Workspaces. You can adjust these things. The defaults, I don't know. I don't find them particularly useful. This is what works for me, but really whatever makes sense to you, right? You can kind of snap and align those things, or if you want to sort of snap, it should snap into the upper right-hand corner, so I can just kind of tighten those things up. But you don't want to have, I generally don't want these all docked underneath each other because then you're kind of going back and forth and you can't really work with them. So depending on your screen setup, screen real estate, you may or may not have kind of enough space there. So another thing you're going to want to do a lot of the time is turn on your rulers view. I've kind of had those turned off. So Control R turns on your rulers. Now this is where we're going to get into just using guides. So now we're going to start, now that we're kind of familiarized ourselves with shapes, now we're going to start kind of working with some of our sort of guides and layouts. And this is starting to get into more designing stuff, just kind of randomly putting things down on the screen. A lot of times we kind of want to start laying things out. So this is kind of an introduction to basic laying out of graphics. Now, like I've mentioned before, Artboards and Adobe Illustrator, they are meant to work in, alongside, typically in print anyways, for like newsletters and quarterly reports or whatever, Adobe InDesign for your layout, so your type work. And we're going to be basically linking Adobe Illustrator files to Adobe InDesign. So we're doing kind of those 2 pieces of software work together a lot of the time. But Illustrator is really flexible because you can use it to export graphics for web, or maybe you're putting together a PowerPoint presentation, you need a background image or a graphic or a chart or whatever. That's what Adobe Illustrator is really all about. So guides help us plan out how big our graphics should be so that they can work in our other layouts. Okay, so you got to turn your rulers on before you can start dragging guides. Now another thing here is grids. So we can just go show grid. Okay, so there's what's called the document grid. Now the document grid is not oriented to your artboards in any particular way. It will by default be oriented to the first artboard that you created, but of course you can move those around. If you zoom way out, if you do Control minus, you'll see that there's this really large workspace. It's square. It's really, really large. You can have a lot of artboards in the workspace. It's relative to the kind of document size, your artboard size, but it's typically like 10 times as big as your main primary artboard size. Everything can fit anywhere you like in there, it doesn't matter. If you want to move these 3 artboards up to the left-hand area of our workspace, we could do that. But by default, it starts in the middle. But you'll see that 0 is kind of arbitrarily like here. And that's because your origin point, which is basically right up in this upper left-hand corner, you can move that around to whatever you're working with. So typically you want to make it relative to the artboard you're working on. So you get comfortable with the idea of moving your origin point for your margins. I'm going to bring up another palette here as well called the Info palette. Okay, so this is like a palette that gives you the info. This one's been docked with my appearance palette, which doesn't make sense. I'm just going to have it on its own for now. You can see how it shows X and Y location of my pointer, whatever it might be. So that's relative to the origin of whatever artboard I'm working on. So because I had set my origin to the upper left-hand corner of the third artboard, right? See how that changes? 0, 0, right there on my grid. So it's relative to the artboard size. If I move it over here, you can see it's going negative because this is my active artboard. So there is also a palette for your artboards. It's kind of like a layers palette, but you can see I've got these two selected right now. But I can jump to any artboard at 100% or whatever fits on my screen by double clicking on it. And that basically orients Adobe Illustrator to what artboard it's paying attention to. So artboard 1, there's the 0 point right there, upper left hand corner. Okay, now if I double click on this, you can see that I've got information about this artboard. And because I had just sort of randomly resized it, it's 5.3 whatever by 4.3 whatever, but the origin of it is 0, 0. That's relevant, that's relative to the grid. So you can fine tune or adjust your artboards by double clicking here and changing it. You can customize the name. But say I want to go back to my 8.5 by 11. Okay. Now if I hit OK on that, this is going to create overlapping artboards. And you got to be aware that you can do this in Illustrator. You can overlap your artboards. It should be avoided though, because what's going to happen is anything that's touching, depending in the order stack of these, because notice how these have an order stack just like layers. So if I use my artboard tool to move it, anything that might have been touching from this artboard is going to go with it. So you kind of want to do this by the numbers if you're going to mix artboard sizes and stuff like that. You also kind of typically want to avoid putting them on fractional off the grid, like just round this up. So -5 inches will work. That's just going to help if you need to switch over to pixel snapping when it comes to placement and stuff like that. But we're not going to worry about that right now. What we are going to focus on is dragging guides and stuff around and working with guides in general. So the most basic way to start with a guide is you got horizontal and vertical guides. But Illustrator is really cool and they can make very custom guides out of pretty much any shape you want. But as a basic, a vertical guide, you click and drag from the ruler and over, and that gives you a guide. We bring up our layer structure, you can see that a guide actually counts just like a path or a shape, but it's just called a guide. You can also do a horizontal guide. Okay, so these are things that you can adjust, you can slide around, but they don't print. They're hideable and they're not printable shapes. So they're used for aligning things, building our own custom grids, all this kind of fun stuff. You can also rotate guides. Okay, so you can go Object, Transform, Rotate, and say we want a 45-degree angle grid, 45. So you can make custom grids of any angle. If you want to create yourself a 45-degree grid or an isometric 30-degree grid, you can do that using guides. You can also take any shape. You can make a circular guide if you want. Okay, so let's just draw ourselves a circle. Or an oval. Let's actually apply a color to it so you can see it. Okay, so say I want this turned into a guide. I can go, I think it's under View, Guides, Make Guides. So So that turns my oval shape into a oval guide. So we can do that with literally anything. Say you want a curvy guide that you want to follow. There's all kinds of reasons that you might give yourself guides in your layouts, but just be aware that you can customize them and make them. Generally what we want to do is we want to also lock our guides so that we don't keep accidentally selecting them while we're drawing and snapping to them. So we can just, once we're happy with our guide, say we've got a custom guide that we need to follow, you can lock your guides, and now you won't be able to select them, but when you're drawing your shapes, it'll still snap to your guide. So say you want to make kind of a real custom shape that followed an oval like this, but you didn't want to actually have the oval visible, then you could do your kind of drawing and use that. So you want to do kind of a, I don't know what this would be, some sort of a goofy kind of shape, sunfish kind of thing, kind of ugly with a mix of curves and straight lines, but whatever. That's starting to get a little more into style, which I'm not going to really talk about in these videos. You can do whatever type of graphics you want, but generally speaking, when we're drawing, like with a pencil in real life, we don't switch between curvy lines and straight lines that much because that wouldn't be very natural. We don't pick up a ruler and start using a ruler a little bit and then take away the ruler and draw straight lines. That's why when you do something like that, it's not the most natural looking. Anyways, you know, now if I hide my guides, shortcut for that is Control semicolon or Control colon. Yeah, it's just, that has followed that oval. It's just not obviously in there, but that's, a lot of times we kind of want to do that within our designs, is we want an interior custom shape to follow a guide or a curve or whatever, so that would be a pretty common reason to make a custom guide like that. So that can be kind of a good exercise. Just turn on your grid, set your origin to 0, 0 on your artboard, drag a couple of horizontal and vertical one, rotate one, and then make a shape, any shape you like, into a guide. And there you've kind of got pretty much everything there is to know about making a custom kind of grid for guides. And if you remember in some of my earlier videos when I went through the tools, I was sort of saying how the perspective grid tool isn't super useful. And I mean, it kind of is. It's just Illustrator is not ideal for that sort of thing. And if you're used to doing 2-point or 3-point perspective, you kind of know that you don't really need a full perspective grid. You really just need a couple of points, a horizon line and a couple of reference points. So custom guides can be a little more useful and a little less visually noisy, and really help you if you got to draw something in 2-point perspective or 1-point perspective or whatever. Custom guides are my preferred way to do it. Just a little less visually noisy. And then if I'm doing layout stuff, turning on your standard square grid is a good way to go. But this is where understanding your rulers and relative sizing and overall ratio between your layout and other graphics or whatever, understanding Artboard and your rulers can be really useful, because you can now go, okay, well, my Google Doc or whatever, you know, I've got 2-inch margins, so my headers need to be 7 inches wide. Well, you can very easily now start making your boxes for your graphics or your type or whatever that you're going to export so that it all fits. So that's what my next video is going to be about, is about working with photos, which is something that Adobe Illustrator is absolutely up to the task for doing. And it's more about using it to make graphics for use in other pieces of software. But for this tutorial, use the guides and the grids, get yourself comfortable with those. Save your file, and we'll be ready to move on to the next one.